Have you ever felt like you're living the same story over and over? Like you're stuck in a pattern you can't break free from? Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychologist, made an extraordinary discovery. We might all be living out ancient myths without even knowing it. And the most powerful of these? The hero's journey. Jung found something fascinating when studying his patients. Whether they were rich or poor, educated or not, they all seemed to be acting out patterns that appeared in myths from around the world. He realized these weren't just stories. They were maps of the human psyche. Let's start with what Jung actually discovered about the hero's journey. Through years of working with patients and studying mythology, he found that the hero myth wasn't just entertainment. It was a psychological blueprint that plays out in our lives whether we want it to or not. Jung observed that the hero's journey typically begins with what he called the call, a moment when ordinary life can't continue as before. Sometimes it's dramatic, like losing a job or facing a health crisis. Other times it's subtle, like a growing feeling that something's missing in life. Sound familiar? Jung found this pattern repeating across cultures and throughout history. Here's what Jung noticed about the typical stages of the hero's journey in psychological terms. First comes the departure from the ordinary world. Jung saw this happen when people could no longer maintain their usual way of living. Maybe their relationships stop working, their career feels meaningless, or they face a crisis that forces change. Jung observed that many people try to ignore this call, but it usually gets louder until they have to respond. Then comes what Jung called the descent, facing challenges and often entering a psychological underworld. This might mean dealing with depression, confronting past trauma, or facing parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Jung found that this stage is necessary for growth, even though it's uncomfortable. Jung discovered something crucial. The hero's greatest enemies often represent parts of themselves they haven't acknowledged. He called these the shadow aspects of personality. When someone complains about always meeting the same type of difficult person, Jung would say they're encountering their own unrecognized traits. Here's a practical example Jung often used. A person who prides themselves on always being nice might keep meeting aggressive people who upset them. Jung would say these encounters are forcing them to confront their own suppressed anger and learn to be more assertive. Jung found that the hero's journey isn't just about fighting external battles. It's about integrating different parts of the psyche. He observed that every hero needs both masculine and feminine qualities, both strength and vulnerability, both wisdom and foolishness. This integration is what makes the journey transformative. One of Jung's most important discoveries was about the role of helpers on the journey. In myths, these appear as wise old men or women, magical animals, or divine beings. In real life, Jung found they might be therapists, mentors, friends, or even books that appear just when needed. He called these manifestations of the self, parts of our deeper wisdom appearing in external form. Jung identified several common challenges people face on their hero's journey. The first is what he called inflation, when someone identifies too strongly with the hero role and loses touch with their ordinary humanity. Jung saw this in people who became convinced they were specially chosen or destined for greatness. Another challenge Jung observed was getting stuck in the victim stage of the journey. Some people become comfortable with suffering and resist moving forward. Jung found this often happened when the pain of growth seemed greater than the pain of staying the same. Then there's what Jung called false individuation, trying to become special by being different from others rather than by being authentically yourself. He saw this in people who adopted exotic spiritual practices or radical lifestyle changes without real inner transformation. But Jung made an encouraging observation. These challenges are actually part of the journey, not obstacles to it. Even apparent failures can move the process forward if we learn from them. Jung found that the hero's journey often involves facing what he called the dragon, a symbol for the greatest fear or challenge in someone's life. But here's the fascinating part. He discovered that the dragon often guards exactly what the person needs for their development. For example, Jung worked with a man terrified of losing control. His dragon was the fear of chaos. But when he finally faced this fear, he discovered new creativity and spontaneity that enriched his life. The very thing he feared contained what he needed. Here's something practical Jung observed. The hero's journey often requires giving up who you think you should be to become who you really are. He found that many people get stuck trying to live up to an ideal image rather than discovering their authentic self. Jung noticed that this journey has different challenges at different life stages. In youth, the challenge is often separating from family patterns and establishing individual identity. Jung saw many young people struggling between the safety of the familiar and the call to their own path. In midlife, the journey often involves questioning everything you've built. Jung found this stage particularly crucial. It's when many people either wake up to their deeper nature or become increasingly rigid and defensive. In later life, Jung observed the journey often becomes about legacy and meaning, how to turn your individual experience into something valuable for others. One of Jung's most profound insights was that the hero's journey isn't linear. It's more like a spiral, revisiting similar themes at deeper levels. He found that people often face the same core challenges repeatedly, but each time with greater understanding. Jung discovered something surprising. Resistance to the journey is part of the journey. When people try to avoid change, the psyche often creates crises that force growth. He saw this in patients who developed symptoms that made their old way of life impossible, pushing them toward necessary changes. Here's a practical point Jung emphasized. The hero's journey isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming real. He found that true psychological growth often means accepting flaws and limitations rather than trying to overcome them. Jung observed that modern society often lacks the rituals and support structures that traditionally helped people navigate this journey. This makes it more challenging, but also more important to understand these patterns consciously. So how do you know if you're in the middle of a hero's journey? Jung identified several signs like feeling like your old life no longer fits, encountering the same problems repeatedly, experiencing a calling you can't ignore, meeting people who mysteriously help or challenge you, facing fears that seem both personal and universal. Jung found that understanding these patterns can help make sense of life's challenges. Instead of seeing difficulties as meaningless suffering, you might recognize them as part of a larger process of development. But he also warned against taking this too literally. The point isn't to fit your life into a predetermined pattern, but to use these archetypal images to better understand your own unique journey. Jung's research showed that the hero's journey isn't something we choose. It's built into the structure of the psyche. The only choice is whether we engage with it consciously or let it play out unconsciously. So are you trapped in a myth? Jung would say yes, but that's not a bad thing. Understanding the myth you're living can help you live it more consciously and completely. After all, as Jung discovered, these patterns exist to help us become more fully ourselves. Remember Jung's words, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Maybe the hero's journey isn't a trap at all. Maybe it's the path to becoming who you're meant to be.